Chapter 8. Troubles and Challenges Cave Complex. Issei's Mindscape 2 days had now passed since Reinare's death and Issei's humiliating defeat at the hands of the replicated Saiyan warrior. In true Saiyan form, Issei's determination had only grown in the wake of his utter trouncing. While it was a blow to his pride, he was glad for the experience. He had seen a glimpse into the level of power that Saiyan should possess, and it drove him to attain a perfect mastery of his power and potential. Because if that was the power of a mindless replica from the past, then Issei had a long way to go to catch up to his forebears. It was with this in mind that Issei found himself within a coastal cave complex in his mindscape. The cave system in question he had explored with friends as a young preteen. The caves twisted and turned for miles. When Issei had explored them as a child, the water had barely been ankle height regardless of the tidal shifts. If it had grown higher, he would have left. That wasn't the case now, however. In a drive for further strength, Diedrich was causing the water level to rise and fall at random. Issei was never aware of when or for how long he would find himself submerged. His Saiyan strength and ki control granted him a superb lung capacity, and swimming became a simple task as with his ki he also flew through the water. The water drained down to knee level as Issei crept along further into the main cave complex. His weighted armor was dragged down by the water that clung to it and dripped off his body. Creatures of stone prowled the corridors like living guardians. Thick, broad chests with disjointed legs and arms. A blank stone where a face should have been. Issei rounded a corner and 4 such titans stood before him. The creatures ranged in height from 3 feet to almost 10. As they were summoned by Diedrich as opposition for Issei. The creatures were mute and emotionless. This didn't stop them from launching at Issei with brutal intent. Issei twisted himself to the left as a granite foot passed by his head with less than an inch to spare. His right fist flew forward with tremendous speed and power. It struck true against the torso of his first adversary. Pain shot through Issei's hand. The smooth granite body of the creature was far harder than any material Issei had ever encountered. The young warrior had no time to ponder the pain he felt as an adversary to his right launched a punch at him. Issei's instincts reacted faster than his mind, and his left hand dove overhand on the disjointed limb. A blast of ki forcing the dangerous fist away and propelling him upward and over the creature in a nimble somersault. He released a further ki blast on the armored shell of the construct's back, causing it to develop a hairline crack. With precision, he followed up with a straight kick to the weakened area. The rock shattered as his foot propelled the golem backward. Before Issei could rebalance, a fist caught his chest in a haymaker and drove him to the ground. Issei landed hard and was crushed further into the dirt of the cave as another golem stamped down onto his chest. The red plates of his armor creaked and squealed under the immense weight of the monster. Issei grimaced and charged 2 bursts of ki, 1 in each of his hands. As the golem slammed a heavy foot down onto him again, he fired the twin blasts into the socket where the creature's legs should have met its abdomen. The blast struck home into the curved recess, and the lower section of the beast burst in a spray of rock and gravel. The foot collapsed to the side harmlessly, now completely inert. Issei's reprieve was short-lived though, as a swift kick from an adjacent golem caught his side and he was thrown away from the group of beasts and along the corridor. He skidded to a halt and rolled onto his feet. His blood was pumping and a wide grin on his face. He had told Diedrich that he wanted to be pushed in his training, and this was doing it. The 3 intact creatures lumbered toward him while the wounded one pulled itself along the ground toward him. Issei braced himself, feeling the water begin to rise again. He dug into the pool of ki within himself and released a large flow of ki toward his palms. 2 large orbs of blue-white ki materialized perfectly in his arms. With a scream he thrust his arms forward, colliding the two blasts together. A potent beam fired from his interlocked blasts and connected with the upright golems. The beast's legs dug into the ground as they fought back against his ki. The water reached Issei's waist and he let out a further bestial scream, the ki in his beam growing in intensity. The golems couldn't withstand the increased intake of energy and their bodies shattered at the power of Issei's attack. He dropped his arms, evaporating the attack as the third beast perished. Issei realized too late that the fourth creature had been unharmed as it collided into his legs in the form of an underwater spear tackle. The impact drove him backward and under the rising water. The golem clawed up his abdomen and began belting its armored fist into his chest. Issei thrashed as he struggled to block and parry the blows as they twisted and tumbled in the dark water. A strong blow rattled against Issei's helmet and stars twinkled in his vision. Issei shifted right as another blow passed to the side of his head. He twisted and rolled on top of the creature and drove his legs downward onto its chest in a double kick that forced them apart from each other. The blow cracked and shattered the weakened golem's chest and the two combatants tumbled away from each other. The water now filled the cave completely. Issei's lungs began to sting at the lack of air and the pressure of the armor pushing down onto him. He struggled to orientate himself, now fully submerged in the murky water, and twisted himself until he could feel the roof. Grabbing a hold firmly to prevent further disorientation, he channeled his ki. He knew the ground above him was thick but would lead to fresh air. He focused as much ki as he could as the golem began swimming toward him again. The beast swam directly toward him whilst clearly aiming to strike at his head. Issei waited until the last safe moment, lungs starting to cry out for air, and pushed himself off the roof and down just as the golem shot into the space he had occupied. With the creature above him and trying to turn, Issei unleashed the beam of compressed ki directly into and through the creature and into the passage roof. The beam evaporated his opponent and continued driving into the dirt roof above. The ki tore through earth, rock and granite alike, but each second taxed Issei of energy as he felt a burning pull in his chest as his vision began to blur. Issei fired himself upward into the tunnel being created by his blast, beginning to silently choke as the beam of energy tore through the final layer of ground, and not a moment later Issei himself propelled out into the fresh exit. He broke free and soared into the air while heaving in as much clear oxygen as he could with his helmet still on to refill his critically empty lungs. The ground shook as he landed roughly beside Diedrich, with his vision only beginning to clear, and pulled off his helmet as stars still twinkled before him. Despite his exhaustion and asphyxiation, Issei still placed his helmet down carefully as a true warrior should. He remained on his feet though as the great dragon spoke to him with amusement heavy in his voice. Maybe that was a bit too intense. Issei waved him off. No, not at all. That was perfect. I have to push my limits. Always strive to surpass myself. His voice was heavy with gasps in between each sentence as he regained his composure and his lungs finally stopped screaming at him. Diedrich let out a chuckle that became a low roll of laughter. Issei looked at his partner with a quizzical expression and waited for a reply. You are becoming more of a saiyan every day, the dragon replied to the silent question. Issei considered the remark for a moment and a smile broke across face. He liked that. The two spent the rest of the time together in silence, with Issei in deep meditation. His control of ki had grown immensely over the previous month, but he knew that he had a marathon of work to go before he could consider himself a master of the potent energy. Flight and energy attacks still drained him greatly, and the Gaelic gun depleted his stores of ki at an incredible rate. Gremory Mansion, Hell. The next morning found Issei, Rias and Akano summoned to the Gremory Mansion. As the group arrived, they were greeted by Kaneko, Kiba and Asia. Asia had stayed with Kiba after her rescue from Reinare's clutches. She had been uncertain about living in hell, but after a long talk with Kiba and meeting Sirzex and Grafia, she had agreed to stay there as long as Kiba was there. For someone who had spent so much of her life living under the church, the change was difficult to say the least. When she had awoken at Issei's home the day before, the peerage had explained as much as they could to her. She remembered being taken by Rainier and her associates. She remembered the harsh treatment she received at the hands of the fallen angels and that they had murdered her. Everything after that had been filled in by Kiba with small inputs by the rest of the group. Initially, Asia felt disturbed and aghast at the idea of being a devil herself. It created a moral dilemma for the young woman who was unsure of her new place in the world, but through discussion with Kiba, her feelings for the young knight and the fact that even as a devil, he came directly to her rescue her helped, and the very forthright and polite treatment she was receiving swayed her attitude on the matter. While she was still uncertain about many aspects of the changes, he was certain that she now wanted to stay with Kiba no matter the difficulties. Lunch, she had gone to hell and been settled into the room next to Kiba's. Despite the fallen angel threat being eliminated, Rias still wanted the group to remain safely in hell for the next few days until new accommodation on Earth could be arranged. With their group now all located in the Gremory mansion, the friends with their new friend made their way to the meeting room often used by the family for formal affairs. The room's long table sat with a small assortment of snacks and sandwiches. Everyone took their seats in the comfortable chairs, Rias, Akeno and Issei to the left side of the long wooden table and Kiba, Kaneko and Asia to the right. Conversation was light, yet Issei was unresponsive to any verbal prompts. Rias looked to him and found the saiyan to be staring ravenously at the food, as so with a sigh she tapped his shoulder to gain his attention and nodded to the plates, giving him permission to assault the food. In the blink of an eye, a platter of cheese, ham and tomato sandwiches had been consumed by the ever-hungry saiyan as he chewed with a happy smile on his face. Asia was surprised and moderately revolted by his inhuman display. She turned to Kiba with a voice filled with unease. "Do all devils eat like that?" she asked shyly. She herself hadn't noticed any change to her appetite. The devils chuckled and Asia became confused by their reaction. Kiba smiled as he spoke to her, his left arm around the back of her chair in a loving manner. "Issei's not a devil." That wasn't a reply Asia had expected, and her face spoke the next question for her in an unspoken manner. The saiyan himself replied with his mouth still puffed full of food. "I be unsaibion," he mumbled around his mouthful. Rias groaned and Akeno smacked him over the head playfully. "Swallow your food first." Both girls reprimanded the young warrior. Issei swallowed his mouthful and scratched the back of his head with an apologetic smile. "I'm a saiyan," he said again in a much clearer voice. Asia was about to ask for more clarification when the doors to the room opened with Sirzex and Grafia striding in. The pair approached the table and the group stood from their seats in a sign of respect. Issei continued to eat as he watched Sirzex approach, and both senior devils couldn't help but slightly smirk at the saiyan's behavior. The group sat after the Lord of Hell and his wife had taken their seats, and Rias waited patiently for her brother to begin the meeting. "I have a few points I would like to discuss this morning." The powerful Satan began in a professional tone. "Firstly, can anyone here explain why you fought against the fallen angel group despite my explicit instructions that you were specifically not to?" Sirzek's voice held a tone of absolute authority as he spoke, and only Rias could hear the slight inclination of something else in his words. She went to reply, but Issei beat her to it, having consumed all the food on the table and now paying attention to the conversation fully. "They attacked us while we were on a hunt. We won. Pretty simple really, he replied in a nonchalant voice, going so far as to placing his hands behind his head as he spoke. Rias groaned inwards at her love interest's reply. He had a habit she had noticed of paying very little attention to the position of authority her brother occupied. If the king of hell was annoyed, he covered it with experienced perfection whilst maintaining a neutral tone and expression as he continued to speak. I see. Would you care to elaborate? He replied toward his sister in particular. Rias nodded and relayed everything that had happened in detail. Kiba's messages with Asia, their suspicion of hellhounds, the discovery of the mutilated rogue devil, the ambush by Reynare's retinue, the defeat of Raynaer and the majority of her group culminating in the resurrection of Asia. She deliberately kept Issei's use of the Gaelic gun from the explanation as it wasn't specifically pertinent, and if Issei wanted to let Sirzex know then he would. Sirzex processed the explanation as it was given to him and smiled to himself. Well, it seems you didn't deliberately disobey me then, but a fair degree of luck was afforded to you all in surviving that encounter. His words took on a softer tone now as he spoke to the group. The devils sighed inwardly at being let off the hook, while Issei took on a facial expression that said luck had nothing to do with defeating Raynaer. Rias and Akeno caught his expression, and both girls felt an exhausted sigh releasing internally at his continued confidence and ego. Now for the second point of interest for today, Sirzex continued while either ignoring or not seeing Issei. He then motioned Grafia to take over, and all eyes in the room changed to her. Grafia walked around the table and swept her hand over a painting on the wall adjacent to the table the group sat at. The painting vanished and a large LCD monitor replaced it. The monitor flickered to life, showing a three-dimensional representation of the Earth. What we are about to share with you all is quite sensitive. Normally you wouldn't be privileged to such information, but for reasons that will become apparent, we want you all to be aware of events that have unfolded recently. She spoke with a professional tone that would be expected of a senior military official briefing such a matter. The group, including Issei, gave her 100% of their attention and sat silently in their chairs without making a single movement as Grafia continued. All throughout Earth someone or something has been attacking groups of angels, fallen angels and devils without concern. This adversary most recently struck in western Russia, approximately 220 kilometers east of Moscow. This is the first time we have been able to capture imagery of the adversary. In this particular event, a group of 8 or 9 highly trained and skilled angels were killed by this foe. Normally we wouldn't stress about the death of angels, but as this foe defeated them so easily, and absolutely we are concerned about the threat they may pose to our own forces operating on Earth. As she spoke, the display zoomed into Russia and displayed a series of 3 images. Each had been taken at night and from a great distance. As such, the quality and clarity was lacking, but the shapes of the photographs were clear enough. The first image showed 5 angels with light weaponry in combative stances against a humanoid opponent. More angels lay around the opponent, coated in blood with their wings and clothing torn apart. The second image showed 1 angel getting blasted apart by an energy wave of green-looking ki. 2 of the other angels were attempting to impale their adversary but unable to land a blow, whilst their remaining compatriots had joined the bleeding masses on the ground. The third image showed the opponent standing whilst all the angels lay motionless on the ground. The features of the mystery opponent were a bit more visible in this photo, revealing part of his face. Not enough to identify though. Only one eye was visible, its color not quite clear, a shade of brown perhaps. Messy dark brown hair, and most prominent of all, a long brown tail that swished through the air in a very ape-like manner. Issei rose to his feet at this image, and his tail unraveled from his waist as it swung through the air in a manner that replicated the adversary on the photo. All eyes turned to Issei, and Rias spoke the words that everyone was thinking. Another saiyan, she said in a voice close to a whisper. Issei paid her words no mind as he attempted to memorize every detail of the other possible saiyan. The facial features, the arrogant expression of superiority, the cold, remorseless eyes, the shape of his body, his height, the way he dispersed his weight as he stood, his tail. Exactly, Sirzex confirmed. This is the only images we have of this opponent. But he does appear to be another saiyan. We can't discount the possibility, and so that is why I want all of you to be aware of this, as the only other known saiyan is of course Issei. Sirzek's voice was still completely professional as he spoke. His eyes trained on Issei, watching the young saiyan stare intently at the screen. When was this? Issei asked, not taking his eyes from the screen. Over a month ago, Graphia replied with a professional tone matching her husband's. The whole group stayed in silent contemplation for a while until Rias decided to break the silence and start a new conversation. There is probably no need for Kiba, Kaneko and Asia to stay here any longer, but I would like them to stay somewhere as a group to be safe. Graphia and Sirzex agreed, and the group began a discussion on the living arrangement for the 3 junior devils. As Issei listened, he realized that he had the perfect solution and spoke up. There is an apartment complex opening up at the end of my street. It would be close and they could stay together. Everyone agreed, and Graphia left to begin the necessary arrangements. It was also agreed that Asia would be enrolled in Kuo Academy to not only continue her education but also to allow her to stay with the group during the day. I have a final matter, Rias. Sirzex directed solely to his sister. Rias' eyebrow raised and awaited for him to continue. Mother and father will be home within the fortnight and are very keen to meet Issei. The tone Sirzex used made it clear that he had perhaps told them more than just the facts about the young saiyan. Rias groaned internally at the idea that her parents may now suspect her feelings and seek to probe her for information. Without waiting for a reply, Sirzex stood from his chair, gave his sister a knowing look, and left the room after his wife. Shortly after the departure of the Lord of Hell, the group split and went their separate ways. Asia, Kaneko and Kiba packed their possessions to begin moving into their new abode. Kiba and Kaneko made arrangements to collect the rest of their belongings from their previous homes, while Issei, Rias and Akeno returned to the Hyodo residence. Issei didn't speak much to either girls and went to finish his homework. The whole time the thought of another saiyan swirled around in his mind. Why was this other saiyan attacking people? Was he an enemy, or was there a reason? Issei didn't know what to expect, but he knew that he needed to increase his training in case they fought. He wouldn't let this mystery opponent have the advantage. Akeno and Rias remained behind in the living room and sat together on the couch. Akeno broke the silence, speaking her mind. Are you concerned about this as well? She asked directly. Of course, Rias replied. We've seen how powerful Issei can be. Who knows what another saiyan could do? He could be like the one Issei fought in his mind. That would be terrible. She paused for a moment and continued. I don't know how we would fight that. And if we couldn't fight him, I might lose someone. Someone special. Her voice broke slightly. Like you or Issei. She said the final words softly, almost as if not quite wanting to admit them. Akeno heard the words though and placed her left hand on top of Rias' right hand. You won't lose anyone, she said with a smile. You're too hot for us to want to leave you, she added with a cheeky smile and a hand squeeze before jumping to her feet and leaving the room abruptly. She headed down the hallway and out the front door. That conversation had become a little more serious than she was quite comfortable with. Akeno loved to flirt, and she knew where her feelings lay for both Rias and Issei, but wasn't quite prepared to act on them yet despite her flirtations otherwise. Ria stayed and sat in thought with a blush to her face at what she had said. Recently she had noticed the similarities of her feelings for both Issei and Akeno becoming closer and closer. She also realized that those for Akeno had been there a long time without her ever acknowledging them. Rias also knew that she wanted both of them, and her devil instincts told her to possess both. She fought against that possessive side though, as she wanted anything that would develop to be genuine and not simply a manipulation of her power. The day played out with the trio remaining mostly to themselves. Issei didn't notice the tension between the two girls as he was focused entirely on the possibility of another warrior like himself being active in the world. Dinner came and Issei cooked while the girls showered. Rias enjoyed the calming effects of the warm water flowing down her body. She wasn't sure why, but she was feeling more tense than she could explain. There was a fluttery feeling constantly in her body that amplified at the sight of either Issei or Akeno. When she thought of either of them, a smile came to her face that was replaced by a blush once she realized it was there. She stayed in the shower much longer than usual after turning off the water, just allowing the steam to float around her. She opened the shower door and froze in place. Before her was Akeno, equally as naked as her. The surprise of finding the shower occupied shocked Akeno, and Rias let out a short scream, more from shock than anything else. The pair stared at each other's bodies and a heavy red covered their cheeks. Akeno hadn't expected Rias to still be in the shower after having heard the water turn off so much earlier, and Rias was just as equally taken aback. The door burst open and Issei rushed in, having heard the scream and instinctively coming to help. He skidded to a halt at the sight of both senior girls naked as the day they were born. Issei's mouth went dry immediately, and as much as he wanted to not look, he couldn't tear his eyes from his two beautiful roommates. His intrusion broke both girls from their trance, however, and they turned to him quickly, covering their bodies with their hands while all three began spluttering out apologies. Issei leapt back and knocked the bathroom door off its hinges in his haste to leave the room. Rias grabbed her towel and dashed to the room she shared with Akeno as fast as she could muster. Akeno simply went into the shower and once the water hit her began laughing quietly. All three were intelligent people, but Akeno knew that she was far more in tune with her feelings than the other pair, and that if anything was to happen it would have to be her that initiated it. She thought on that and decided she wasn't ready herself for such a leap forward and would see how things played out. After all, she had known Issei less than a month, and while she knew Rias for a very long time, her friends' acceptance of their feelings and subsequent growth in them had only happened since they had met Issei, most prominently since moving in with him. Once all three were finished cleaning themselves and Issei had finalized the lamb korma he was preparing, the group sat down to eat. Tension filled the air slightly, and not even Akeno could bring herself to tease either of her housemates about it. The tension increased when the trio made their way to the bedroom. Over the recent nights, Issei had slept with the two girls so that they could all train in his mindscape. Each one knew this was a simple ruse to be close to each other, but no one spoke the truth, and so the ruse worked. Tonight, however, as Issei pulled his weighted shirt off, revealing his defined muscular body, he could feel the penetrative stares of both devils on his back. He slipped in between the sheets and covered himself with the blankets as quickly as possible, while trying desperately not to watch both girls move around in their nightgowns before climbing into bed. He tried with all his willpower but still couldn't help but watch the pair from the corners of his eyes. Their every move seemed like a graceful torture to the saiyan. Soon the light was off and he felt the cool hands of both girls on his chest as he changed his plane of existence. Whiteness. Issei's Mindscape. The four members of Issei's Mindscape chatted together, planning out a schedule for the night's training. In the presence of the great dragon, the tension was cut as it became far easier to talk without feeling the swell of flirtatious feelings. Issei explained the chances of another Saiyan to Diedrich and wanted to find a new way to increase his training regime. With that in mind, Diedrich released another burst of memories for Issei to sift through and find something to improve himself. Both girls watched as his hand passed into the memory swirl and his eyes rolled into his head. Issei focused on the images as they flashed before his eyes and finally focused on one that appeared to offer potential. He felt the familiar feeling of himself falling forward, and before long he was soaring through a yellow sky with purple fluffy clouds toward a very small planet. A long concrete pathway led off into the distance below the small planet in a twisted method like a snake slithering along. The planet was so small that Issei estimated he could walk around the whole thing in a matter of minutes. A single house stood on the surface with 2 trees. Issei landed and was instantly flattened into the ground. He gasped and struggled to raise himself up. Each motion caused him to groan at the strain, yet he remained on the ground. He turned to see 2 men standing in the front well-manicured yard of the small dwelling. While one was standing without any difficulty, the other was clearly struggling to stay on his feet. The standing man was a short, pudgy, blue-skinned humanoid. He wore black reading glasses and had a jolly expression on his face with a pair of blue whiskers and short antennae on his forehead. His attire consisted of a black master's martial arts gi over a red shirt. A large white symbol of a fighting style Issei was unfamiliar with was emblazoned on his front and back. The man struggling to remain on his feet wore an orange fighting gi with a blue undershirt. Issei recognized his black hair. The crazy spiky style identified him immediately as the Saiyan that he had seen as a young boy training with the old man and other boy. Strangely, his tail was missing this time. Issei also noticed the striking resemblance between this man and the Saiyan replica that he had fought against. Issei watched as the Saiyan man struggled to remain upright whilst speaking to the other man. After a short conversation, a 3-foot ape approached the pair. The blue man then handed the Saiyan a large black mallet that the Saiyan struggled to lift from the ground. As he did, the ape began running and the Saiyan gave chase after him. Albeit extremely slowly, each step a clear struggle. He swung the mallet at the ape, but each swing was a clear miss with how much he was struggling to move. Issei continuously struggled to push himself up, but eventually got onto all fours before pushing himself up into a seated position. He watched as time sped by. For days the Saiyan chased the ape. Weeks passed in seconds and the man slowly began to move more freely, and eventually he moved as if nothing was restricting him. He swung the mallet and struck the black hammer into the ape. The ape skidded across the ground and went off mumbling to itself as the blue man approached the exhausted Saiyan. The pair spoke and a small figure appeared near the two. The small figure was a humanoid-like insect that greatly resembled a grasshopper. The blue man took the hammer from the Saiyan and replaced it with a much larger red mallet. As the Saiyan lifted the mallet, the blue man passed his hand over the Saiyan and his clothes suddenly dragged down toward the ground. Weighed down with a much greater weight than they had a moment ago. The Saiyan then began chasing after the insect in a manner much the same as he had with the ape. Time once again sped forward for Issei, and while it seemed to him that he had only been in this memory for less than an hour, nearly 6 months had passed for the participants. It was slightly odd to Issei for him to watch so much time pass so quickly and silently. Eventually the Saiyan caught and struck the insect as he had the ape. Once again he collapsed to the ground and the blue man approached. The blue man spoke to the Saiyan with a wide smile on his face and a poorly hidden proud expression. The two continued to talk and the Saiyan adopted a stable stance. Issei watched from his seated position as the Saiyan began focusing his ki internally into himself. Time once again flashed by as the Saiyan focused energy into himself. The Saiyan chanted the same words over and over, and Issei watched his mouth move, intent on learning the words himself. Eventually, after months of practice, the Saiyan screamed the words and the built-up ki erupted in a red flare around himself. The Saiyan stood and leapt. He soared to a monumental height above the planet before returning at a lightning speed that Issei could hardly comprehend. Issei watched in shocked awe as the red aura-clad Saiyan began doing combat and martial arts drills at a blistering pace. Quickly a heavy sweat overtook the Saiyan and he collapsed in a heap, with the red aura vanishing as he did with a great expression of happiness on his face. Issei felt himself float upward and away from the scene, and soon the memory was vanishing from before his eyes. Issei returned to the whiteness of his mindscape, and promptly, without their asking, he began relaying the whole experience to the trio, who listened to him intently. Issei was bouncing up and down with excitement as he spoke. That training had pushed the other Saiyan to his limits and resulted in a technique that Issei knew he had to learn. The group speculated how they could replicate the effects of the planet the training had been conducted on. Diedrich believed the great weight had been a multiplication of the gravity above that experienced on Earth. At Diedrich's suggestion, Issei pictured the industrial complex that he had first fought a rogue devil in. The building he had slain the devil stood before them, with the complex veering off into the distance all around them. Diedrich approached the building and poured his magic into the structure. Once he was finished, he snorted happily to himself and addressed the group. "I have augmented the gravity of that building. Once you step inside, it will be 5 times stronger than Earth, and you can ask me to raise or lower it as you require. I don't know how high I can make it, but we will find out soon enough, I expect," Diedrich stated in his sagely, explanatory tone. Issei approached the building and the girls went to join him when he stopped them. "I don't think you should come in," he said with a firm tone. "The gravity crushed me in the memory. I don't want either of you to be hurt." Both girls looked as if they would argue, but Issei didn't budge, and so the pair returned to being beside Diedrich. Issei entered the building and felt the increased pull on his body. It felt significantly less than that of the memory, and he remained on his feet with only some difficulty. He told the red dragon to increase the pressure, and the gravity jumped to 8 times. Again Issei felt the pressure but wasn't happy with the effect. Again, he yelled and the dragon did so. While he worried for his partner, he accepted that the Saiyan wouldn't allow any attempts to intervene with his pursuit of improvement. The gravity doubled and Issei was thrust into the ground. He groaned under the weight of his heavy armor and fought his body to return to a kneeling position. He did so with a heavy sweat erupting all over himself. Simple movements were a monumental workout. A giant smile cracked across Issei's face behind his helmet. This was what he had been chasing. He climbed to his feet and took a step to begin walking. His knee crumpled into the ground and he was forced into a lunge. The 2 devils watching feared for his safety, but Issei ignored their worried expressions and yelled cockily to Diedrich, "Increase it to 25 times. The dragon did as his friend asked, and Issei was driven downwards, thrust harshly into the ground. His armor was doing its best efforts to force its way through his body as he was rendered into an uncomfortable and impractical sprawled-out position. The 2 devils pleaded with Diedrich to lower the gravity, but Issei shouted harshly amid groans for the gravity to remain. He moved his arms slowly into a position beside his body before straightening out his legs, and with an effort bordering on insane pushed his body up until he was on only his hands and the tips of his toes. A solid push-up position. He slowly and with incredible difficulty began doing push-ups. He reached 15 before collapsing and rolled onto his back to do crunches. Rias and Akeno watched as Issei tortured himself with the intense training. After close to half an hour, neither could continue to watch and so took to the sky to practice and perfect their magic against each other. They darted up and down, left and right, forward and back whilst continuously dueling their spells against each other's. Ria's destruction magic had a definite advantage, but Akeno refused to yield and fought heroically against her best friend and master. Diedrich, with a superb understanding of magic himself, yelled simple but pertinent advice to the two girls on occasion, which they accepted happily. Neither was proud enough to refuse the advice of the Red Dragon Emperor himself. The hours passed and the girls returned to the ground to meditate and discuss tactics with Diedrich. The dragon possessed an immense and comprehensive knowledge of tactics that Rias could utilize with her peerage. When it came to relevant tactics for her with Issei, the dragon had only a few words of wisdom. The power of Saiyans is immense and truly beyond anything we could ever imagine. He began in his deep guttural voice. My advice to you is simple. Identify your strongest opponent or opponents and allow Issei to fight them unimpeded. Rias thought on his advice, and while she didn't like the idea of having to rely on Issei so exclusively, she understood and agreed that the young Saiyan was truly a powerhouse of seemingly unlimited potential. Rias and Akeno continued their training for almost an hour before they heard the sounds of Issei emerging from the enhanced gravity building. He had removed his helmet and such a thick layer of sweat covered him that both girls almost expected him to be draining a small river from his thick armor. He smiled broadly as he approached. That's an amazing workout, he said with a cheerful yet exhausted grin. He was unsteady on his feet with sheer fatigue and yet was finding moving as easy as if he was made of feathers due to the sudden lack of gravity bearing down on him. The group chatted while they rested before Issei broke the connection with this realm and the three returned to the living dimension. Opening their eyes, all three felt the tension from the night before return abruptly. Issei lay shirtless on his back, his only clothing being his loose pajama pants. Akeno lay on his right pectoral with her body pressed against him, and Rias on his left with her body as equally pressed onto him. His arms were curled around the girls and rested on their lower back, almost pulling the two girls into him. His tail wrapped around the waist of Akeno and came over the top of the trio to lay on Rias' side. The whole setup screamed romantic intention, and all three knew it. What the girls didn't know was that while they had been away from the male pair the night before, Issei had spoken with Diedrich whilst he trained. The added difficulty of maintaining a conversation had taxed his lung capacity, which Issei saw as yet another opportunity for training. They had discussed the romantic intertwining that the trio had began to develop, and while the dragon was not overly familiar with the dating and mating customs of humanoids, his advice had been simple. Take a leap and show how you feel. Don't be scared. The use of the word scared had gyrated against Issei as his budding Saiyan pride refused to accept fear, and so with those thoughts running through his mind, he took a quick yet deep breath and decided to act. In a swift motion he pulled both beautiful girls closer to him and turned to each. First his lips collided both softly and yet firmly with Rias, and then he twisted and laid the same kiss onto Akeno's lips. Both girls went wide-eyed as he took a first kiss with both. Before either of the two could reply, though, Issei had slid between them, disentangled himself smoothly and removed himself from the bed in a single motion. Now on his feet though, his courage chose to fail him, and without looking back toward the girls, Issei fled the room and locked himself in the bathroom for a long and much-needed cool shower. Akeno and Rias lay in the bed in a state of shock and mild confusion. Both wore equal blushes and content grins. They faced each other on their sides in the same positions that they had occupied on Issei's chest. The pair were mere inches from each other in between the soft sheets. The heat from their bodies resonated between them as their eyes locked. Both knew what the other was thinking, and they closed the distance between each other with their eyes closing. Issei's simple act had set a feeling of acceptance and reassurance between the two. Whereas yesterday none in the house had felt able to act on their feelings. This morning seemed now to be the perfect time to act. The girls' lips met together in a kiss that lasted a few moments longer than their first with Issei. It was soft and filled with understanding of the other. Still they pulled apart and both immediately felt embarrassed. They had kissed and silently admitted their feelings, but still it was such a change that neither knew how to respond. Akeno, the usually flirtatious and bold, rolled from the bed, took up a change of clothes and left the room to change. She could hear the shower running and instead chose to change in Issei's now almost abandoned bedroom. A giddy smile across her face the whole time. Rias remained in the bed for a few minutes more. She understood that both Issei and Akeno had fled due to nervousness rather than disappointment or anything negative. She was glad they had, as she would have herself if they hadn't. She dressed in a casual purple summer dress and made her way to the kitchen. She knew they would all need to talk about what had just happened, but also knew the best way for that to occur was over breakfast. The food would keep Issei in place and stop the saiyan from fleeing. Akeno she knew would stay once the conversation began, but breakfast would help her bridge the subject. The sweet smell of plain and chocolate pancakes filled the air as both Akeno and Issei entered the dining room and took their seats. Each left a chair free to either side of them. Rias approached the table stacked with food and paused, considering where to sit. They had both kissed her, so she knew where to sit and sat between the pair. The trio sat in silence with Issei hungrily eyeing of the stacks of pancakes. He wouldn't start until the girls had taken their share. Akeno placed a modest stack on her plate, but Rias waited. So, she began simply in a voice that was a heck of a lot calmer than she really felt. Those kisses were something. The trio blushed and Issei scratched the back of his head nervously. Akeno cut part of a pancake off and pushed it nervously around her plate. Issei took a breath and turned to face both girls. "I like you both and want to kiss you both more," he blurted out as if the words might actually kill him. Issei felt his stomach doing back flips as he declared his feelings, albeit in the blunt hammer-like fashion expected of the young warrior. The girls blushed further, but both knew it wasn't the time to be coy about such things. "I feel the same way," Akeno said to the pair. Her face resolved to discuss the events of the morning. "Good," Rias replied. "Because I don't plan on not having either of you," she stated, absolutely like someone who wouldn't be denied. "Of course, Your Majesty," Issei chose to reply with an over-dramatic flair. Akeno burst into laughter as the tension was cut from the air, with Rias scolding Issei that she was an heiress and not a princess. Akeno gave Issei a naughty smile and added a small verbal jab to Rias. "Whatever makes your ladyship happy," she added slyly. Rias turned on her, continuing to scold the pair as they laughed louder and louder. The laughter of the two she had feelings for broke her annoyance, and she joined in the merriment. The group happily ate breakfast before making their way to the clubhouse for club activities hand in hand. As they walked, the trio switched around often, each holding the other's hand simply. Passers-by gave them odd looks, but none cared. Club room. Kuo Academy. Issei sat explaining the gravity training he undertook to Kiba and Kaneko. Asia listened but had to constantly ask questions to understand everything they spoke about. Issei was more than happy to clarify events and facts for her. He explained large amounts about his being a saiyan, his appetite and natural affiliation for all three elements of ki, and his prowess in combat, his constant drive to improve and perfect himself. Diedrich and the mindscape, the memories of millennia past that he studied, and his training and abilities. Asia was stunned. She was impressed by everything devils could do, but the abilities of a Saiyan was at a level so much higher than she could comprehend. When she learnt that Issei had only awoken this power within the last month, she didn't know how to reply. After explaining everything, both Kiba and Kaneko were eager to try enhanced gravity as well. The issue was that none knew a way to implement it or perform the necessary magic. Rias agreed to speak with Sirzex when she saw him next and see what could be done. The group migrated outside and Akeno increased the weight load of Issei's clothing as per his request. His clothing now came to a total of almost 2 metric tons. Rias told Asia to stay by her side so that she didn't get in the way, and the blonde girl did as she was told but didn't know what was about to happen. Issei began to circle around in the large dirt patch with Kiba and Kaneko doing the same opposite him. Kiba wielded a long katana and Kaneko wore her favorite hand wraps. A white pears with red tips and small black cat paw prints. The combatants circled around and Asia realized immediately what was about to occur. Issei took the initiative and kicked off hard from the ground, launching himself at the pair. Despite the tremendous weight that his body was bearing, he flew through the air at speeds faster than most vehicles can hope to achieve. He lashed out with a sweeping kick which Kaneko ducked under and Kiba parried with the flat side of his blade. Issei followed his momentum and flipped over the knight, striking down with a rough overhead kick. Kiba rolled back as the blow swept within millimeters of his flesh and buried itself into the ground. Both devils threw harsh strikes at the Saiyan. A thrust from Kiba and a left cross from Kaneko. Issei deflected and redirected each blow with his forearms and drew his opponents in closer, where he unleashed a series of strikes and elbows at the pair. The devils blocked and dodged, twisting against the attacks, but Kiba suffered a backward elbow strike to the shoulder that drove him harshly to the ground, while Issei twisted at the midriff to allow him to catch a straight punch. From Kaneko, the knight lashed out with a sweeping kick that caught Issei off guard and took his feet out from beneath him. As he fell back, Kaneko curled herself into a ball and unleashed both feet into his chest, winding him and causing spit to fly from his lips. Issei tightened his grip on the small girl's hand and, whilst still recovering from the blows, lifted her up overhead and slammed her whole body into the ground. The dynamic impact rendered Kaneko unconscious, and Issei released her as he rolled away from a lightning-fast overhead strike from Kiba, the blade stopping less than a millimeter from the dirt. As the knight and Saiyan circled each other, preparing to close in for another round of combat, Asia rushed to Kaneko and lay her hands on the small girl. A green energy flowed from her hands. Rias and Akeno watched happily as the energy healed Kaneko of all her wounds and returned her to consciousness. The Nekomata leapt to her feet and rushed at Issei, who was unaware of her. Her left fist crashed into his jaw, knocking him off balance. At that exact moment, Kiba closed the distance between the two and drove his sword at Issei. The warrior in question watched the blade approach and replied with a ki blast that threw the weapon from Kiba's hands. He then tumbled to his right up onto his feet, with now a meter between himself and his adversaries. Issei was unsure how Kaneko was back in the fight until he saw Asia near the arena and knew the newest devil had healed the rook with her magic. Issei smiled and his two opponents returned the cocky smile with ones of their own. Issei let out a guttural yell and a white aura flared around him. It was time to take this to the next level. Kiba inwardly groaned at the sight of Issei escalating his strength. Things were about to get difficult. Issei propelled himself forward and with harsh precision landed a series of strikes on both Kiba and Kaneko that both struggled to see, let alone block. The pair were forced off their feet and Issei caught both by the collar and held them outside of the arena before dropping them, simply depositing the pair outside the training area. A clean win for the Saiyan. Rias and Akeno both clapped for their unofficial boyfriend's victory while Asia healed the wounds of the losers. Issei extended a hand to each of the pair who took it, allowing him to help them to their feet. Both congratulated him while he spoke praise of their ability to force him to up his power to keep up with them. The remaining time of the club activities for the day was spent having lunch and discussing the work assignments for the group that they would complete that week. With the threat of the fallen angels gone, Rias was far more willing for the group to complete tasks themselves. Asia would be doing healing tasks based on her magic and innate abilities. Rias was quite happy to add it to the list of services she could provide, as healing was something rarely offered by a devil in a contract. Before they went to eat, Asia attempted to say a simple prayer but grabbed her head in pain. She said it had happened every time she had prayed recently. Rias explained that now that she was a devil she would be unable to pray or approach a holy site without feeling pain at the acts. Asia was disheartened by this news but promptly resumed her before meal thanks despite the pain, stating that even if she was a devil she still believed in the tenets of God. Rias accepted this as it neither annoyed nor affected her personally, and if a member of her peerage wanted to give herself a headache then Rias wasn't going to stop her. With club activities finished for the day, the members of the Hyodo residence left hand in hand. A fact that had been observed but not commented on by the other members of the peerage. They spent the remainder of the afternoon watching movies and enjoying each other's company. Issei found himself lying down on the couch with both girls pressed against him as they watched The Hangover 2. The three laughed their way through the comedy before turning in for the night. Once in bed, the trio moved into the position they had awoken in that morning. Issei kissed Akeno before turning to do the same with Rias. Each kiss was longer and more confident than the one that morning. As he finished, Issei lay below the pair of girls as they too locked lips to bid each other a good night as well. Issei felt himself having rather indecent thoughts as he watched the two girls he had just kissed kiss each other. It also occurred to him that as they would spend the night together in his mindscape anyway, so a good night kiss was irrelevant, but it still seemed appropriate all things considered. After all, any excuse he could find to kiss either or both of them was something he would take happily. Once in his mindscape, the trio resumed their training. The romantic connection between each other and Issei seemed to drive the girls to increase the intensity of their training and sparring as well, while Issei spent his time in the gravity building at 25 times Earth's gravity. Rias and Akeno sparred with both magic and martial arts throughout the night. Neither was as proficient in hand-to-hand combat as Issei, but they could hold their own, and blushes overcame their faces as the pair grappled before separating apart for another burst of magical volleys. When the trio awoke Monday morning, they started the day as they had finished the previous by greeting each other with what was becoming a progressively deeper kiss each time, each becoming more comfortable with their two partners. They then took to their routine as usual, showering and preparing breakfast before Kiba, Kaneko and Asia arrived. With a large spread of food present across the table, the whole peerage ate together before leaving for school. Asia was immensely excited to start school as she had only ever attended classes in her nunnery and was eager to experience a normal school. Kiba and Asia walked hand in hand while Issei walked between the two senior devils holding a hand of each. Once they reached his class, he gave each a kiss that earned him shocked and angered faces from many of the jealous boys around him. A string of furious muttering followed him regarding the fact that he had just kissed both girls. The girls then left hand in hand as he settled in for another week of classes. He could feel the glances he was receiving filled with jealousy as he sat and waited for the lessons to begin, but he didn't care. It wasn't like any of those guys ever had the courage to try and chat with their beautiful devil. Furthermore, Issei's mood was brought up with this week being their last before they had a 2-week vacation. The sensei entered and the class quieted, allowing for the man to begin his first act to pass out the results of the tests they had taken over the previous fortnight. Issei was relieved to have passed everything, although mathematics was a pass by only 1%. It was his weakest subject after all. But a pass was a pass in his view of things. It wasn't like he really had to focus on his studies as much as he had in the past now after all. Shopping mall. Kuo Town. Monday and Tuesday had flowed by smoothly. Each day started with romance between the trio, followed by quick kisses and embraces when they could find time to be together, and then ended as such. Issei left the girls with a kiss before classes and greeted them with another after classes. In his mindscape they continued to train intensely. None wanted to be a burden for the others in case of fight, which given their lifestyle was bound to occur sooner rather than later. It was now Wednesday evening and Issei was in shopping mall in downtown Kuo Town, not too far from where they all lived. He was doing a joint job with Kiba and Asia. Akano and Kaneko had jobs of their own, while Rias was meeting with Sirzex regarding the very exciting installation of a gravity chamber to the club room. It was a meeting that Issei could say with total conviction that he awaited the response of with bated breath. The job was quite simple. A pair of rogue devils had attacked late-night patrons of the mall. Issei was here to eliminate the threats. Asia would heal any wounded they encountered and Kiba would protect his girlfriend. The pair's relationship had developed quite quickly. After seeing Issei kiss Akano and Rias Monday morning, Asia had turned to Kiba and kissed him quite passionately. Having lived an extremely secluded life, Asia was unaware of many things to do with romance, but she also didn't suffer from embarrassment regarding most, and therefore simply acted on the urge to pursue a relationship with the blonde boy. To say the night had been over the moon may have been an understatement. Many girls around the school had been quite unhappy about the event, though at their desire to date the handsome blonde gentleman. Asia and Kiba kept a few paces back from Issei while the saiyan strode casually throughout the empty mall. The security that would normally work had gone on strike over the recent injuries and killings, which was convenient for the group as they wouldn't have any awkward encounters. The group passed through rows of fashion, jewelry and cosmetics stores, gaming and electronic outlets, all closed and locked up. Reaching the center of the mall complex, they arrived at the food court, a large open plan area with an abundance of seating and tables. Fast food outlets lined the sides of the three-way intersection of the courtyard. An arcade and cinema with a bowling alley took up one direction from the area, while other stores took the rest. Issei entered the center of the courtyard and decided he had spent enough time playing hide and seek with the adversaries. They could come to him. "Hey!" he yelled out loudly. "Come and get me, you pathetic cowards!" Silence filled the area as Issei waited atop one of the larger tables. Asia and Kiba had positioned themselves into a side space between a solid divider and bench-style seating where they could observe without getting in the way, and Knight could protect his new girlfriend. The silence was broken by the sound of scuttling claws. Issei calmed his senses to pinpoint the exact position that the noises were approaching from. He determined them to be from above him and turned to see two lizard-like humanoids climbing down from the ceiling along the walls toward him. Each had long snouts, scaled skin, snake-like eyes, powerful long legs and arms and thick tails. They looked much like a goanna crossed with a human as a hideous hybrid. Issei hummed to himself. This job always had something new for him to deal with. The lizard devils dropped to the ground and charged at him from either side. The one to his right on all fours while the one to his left was upright. The game was on. Issei waited until they got close before firing a ki blast into the armored stomach of the upright one and launching himself toward the scuttling one so as to unleash a powerful roundhouse kick at the beast. The kick connected to the beast's head and it was propelled to the side but twisted around and wrapped its tail onto Issei's right leg. With the tail firmly in place, it squeezed and threw its body at Issei. Issei replied with a powerful punch to the creature's face as it approached. His strike connected and the devil was dazed, but at the same time, he himself was struck off balance as the other devil swung its tail into his ribs. Issei fell back into a table and broke through it to the tiled floor below. He landed on his back and a heavy weight crushed down onto him as a devil dove onto him. It opened its maw and went to bite at Issei's face. Out of pure reaction, he thrust his left hand forward into its mouth while striking its torso with his right. The beast bit heavily into his forearm and Issei winced in pain. The powerful jaws, piercing his skin and drawing thick red blood that pooled in the beast's mouth. Issei channeled ki into his hand and unleashed a large blast down into the creature's throat. Its eyes and cheeks bulged briefly before its head and neck exploded, covering the area in gore, and Issei shrugged the body off of him to the right. He rolled to his feet to see the other reptile lunging at Kiba. The knight was keeping it at bay with short jabs and slashes of his sword, but was avoiding becoming overly engaged as he didn't want to become separated from Asia. Issei floated into the air, allowing his left hand to hang by his side with his blood running down and dripping onto the tiled ground below him. The lizard didn't notice him as Issei floated up behind it and grasped its tail firmly. Issei floated up as the startled beast thrashed below him and then dove into the ground, smashing the beast into the ground below. Without missing a beat, he repeatedly lifted and smashed the devil back down into the ground over and over. The crunching sound of snapping and shattering bones filled the air. After a dozen strikes into the ground, Issei released the devil's tail and rolled his enemy over with his foot. He channeled ki into his hand and fired the compressed energy point blank into the torso of the crippled devil. Its chest cavity exploded and the beast shook only momentarily before becoming still and dead. Issei stood up, coated in the gore of the remnants of his fallen enemies. Kiba and Asia approached. The knight thanked him for the assistance while the nun stared shocked at the carnage. She still hadn't become accustomed to such acts of violence, however, at seeing the blood trickling down Issei's arm, she moved over and began healing his wounds without delay. Issei watched as the green energy flowed over his torn flesh and the skin tingled strangely before it knitted itself back together. Within seconds, the injuries caused by the overgrown reptile had become a simple memory, and Issei thanked Asia for her help. The three then left the mall with Issei messaging his victory through to Rias. Asia questioned about the cleanup of the fight, and neither Issei nor Kiba could think of who actually cleaned up after these hunts. Clearly a cleanup did occur, as no mention ever reached the news, but they didn't know whose job it actually was to conduct such a task. Clubroom. Kuo Academy. Thursday and Friday passed by without much incident. Issei, Rias and Akeno continued to exploring their blossoming relationship. Gentle touches here and soft kisses there. The trio were becoming more and more comfortable in the new relationship they had. With the school term ending and holidays beginning for the next fortnight, clubs had ceased their activities. All except the Occult Research Club, whose president had decided to include Saturdays in their activities for the holiday duration. It was for this reason that the whole group sat around the clubroom awaiting Rias' arrival. They chatted happily, with Asia and Kiba sitting side by side and hand in hand, and Issei and Akeno did the same. Asia, Kaneko and Kiba hadn't confronted the others about their relationship, but they understood that it had evolved into something romantic. The group passed the time with simple chit-chat until the glowing rose of the Gremory symbol filled the room with a soft red light. Rias and Graphia entered the room accompanied by Ajuka. The ever-excited inventor Satan began an instantaneous explanation of how he planned to expand the building to include a gravity chamber. He would be doing the construction and theoretical work whilst Graphia assisted with the magical application. Issei, Kaneko and Kiba cheered at the announcement as they had all been looking forward to and hoping for this outcome. Issei was so excited that he rushed up to Rias and kissed her in response. The room went quiet at the obvious display of affection, and even Issei realized what he had just done. Despite her shock and embarrassment, Rias still returned his kiss before breaking their lips apart. The pair then slowly turned to the rest of the group. Akeno was beside herself, trying and mostly failing to keep her laughter contained. The other members of Rias' peerage looked more awkward than shocked, but it was Graphia and Ajuka that concerned Rias. She knew that a relationship with either Akeno or Issei would not be looked on fondly. Ajuka merely avoided eye contact and left to begin his work, whilst Graphia gave the pair a piercing stare before speaking in a neutral tone that gave no indication to her feelings on the matter. "We will discuss this after I finish building the chamber," she said curtly and left the room. Rias collapsed on the couch next to Akeno, who reached over and gave her a reassuring kiss to the forehead. Issei sat on the other side of Rias and began to softly mumble an apology that she waved off. Silence filled the room until Asia broke it with a question filled by an innocent voice. "So what? Are you both dating Rias or like all dating each other?" she asked simply with a slightly puzzled expression. There was a moment's pause before Akeno took the lead and explained the whole situation to the rest of the peerage. Kiba and Kaneko had already worked out the truth and neither had any issue with the situation, both preferring to stay out of others' personal affairs. Asia congratulated the trio of couples and stated in a bubbly manner that she was always happy to see people enjoying life and being fulfilled in their relationships. Regardless of what the specifics were, everyone continued to chat and enjoy each other's company for the following hour. Akeno and Rias played chess while the group watched. Issei was not much of a player, but he did understand the basic rules. 13 moves later, Rias had claimed victory over her girlfriend. Issei was torn between condolence for Akeno and congratulations for Rias, so he took the middle ground and did both. Each girl smiled at him, but the feeling was broken as bright yellow light flooded the room harshly. The entire peerage turned to see a devil house symbol that Issei was unfamiliar with. It consisted of 2 concentric circles and a bird with spread wings in the center. The whole symbol was of a deep yellow and the light glared against their eyes. As the light faded, a man stood with 2 women either side of him. The man was almost as tall as Issei, with blonde short hair and deep blue eyes. He wore an expensive burgundy blazer with golden embroidery and matching pants. A white dress shirt casually underneath the blazer. His black dress shoes and silver watch looked to cost more than Issei's entire outfit, and he stood in an arrogant holier-than-thou manner. To the right of the man stood a tall, buxom woman with wavy purple hair and eyes. She wore a long lilac dress that looked more suited for a black tie ball than a house visit. The dress hugged her form perfectly, though accentuating her beauty. To the left side of the man stood another woman, this girl much shorter and younger, appearing around Issei's age. Her black hair was tied up in 2 traditional Chinese buns. She had aqua eyes and wore a blue traditional-style Chinese martial arts gi. The man surveyed the group before him before snorting derisively and approaching Rias. "My dear Rias," he began in a tone that was openly mocking, "I have come to claim what is rightfully mine." His eyes swept over Rias in a predatory gaze that made all of her peerage feel appalled and cause a spark of rage to begin building itself within Issei. Rias stepped back from the advances of the man and shook her head. "It's not happening, Riser," she declared defiantly. Riser, as the man had been announced, shrugged his shoulders and continued toward her with the women flanking his sides. "Then I guess my family's deal with your brother will be obsolete." He spoke with a quiet, cocky voice as he continued, "You, my dear fiancé, will in fact marry me." His declaration shocked Issei and Asia, who knew nothing of this. Rias once again shook her head, taking another step back from the man. "No, Riser. I am not a possession to be traded away. I will not do it." Rias' voice was defiant but also timid, as if she was losing her bravado in the face of this man. Issei felt a knot of hatred form in his belly at the actions of this Riser. The way he looked and spoke to Rias sickened him. The way he claimed her as if she was a rightful belonging caused the spark of anger to spread and grow further. Riser ignored everyone else present and then continued to speak in the same tone. "Oh, you will marry me. The Phoenix family is powerful, wealthy and extremely influential. Your family needs mine and you will accept this. I will be adding you to my collection of beauties." Riser made the final statement with a snide sneer before continuing. "I collect beautiful things and women and they always do as I say." To accentuate his point, he grabbed the girl in the Chinese gi and turned her to him, kissing her firmly in a mocking fashion toward Rias and her group. The girl complied with the kiss and made no effort to fight the older man off. As he released her, Riser made a grab for Rias, but she stumbled back and tripped, landing on her backside. Issei and Akeno stepped forward between her and the arrogant devil, who simply laughed heartily with a tone full of mockery. "Oh, your peerage defends you. How cute. You have, let's see." He then counted the group with his eyes ending on Issei. "4 members of your own peerage and 1 freak experiment." He snarled the last words at Issei, which caused the Saiyan's anger to boil higher. Issei was struggling with the urge to strike this arrogant man down. "I don't know why you are resisting, Rias. There is nothing you can do to stop me. I have a full peerage of 15 and you have only a third of that, with one being this useless filthy monkey." The insult had barely left his lips when Issei acted. In a flash of movement that was invisible to most, he closed the distance between himself and Riser, allowing him to deliver a right cross to the devil's jaw. Riser was thrown back and launched through a wall of the club room, landing sprawled on the ground in a heap of rubble and torn dirt. The 2 girls to his side were stunned, as they hadn't even seen Issei move. Riser climbed to his feet and bellowed in anger. "How dare you strike me, you worthless peasant!" Rage filling his voice. Flames erupted around his hands as the members of his peerage rushed to his side. He began to advance on Issei, who took his combative stance when a female voice halted all movement. "There will be no fighting here," Graphia stated absolutely. All those present turned to see Graphia and Ajuka standing in the doorway to the club room. The members of Riser's peerage bowed to the Lord and Lady of Hell in respect, whilst Riser barely shifted his head slightly. "That filthy cretin struck me," Riser stated with a finger pointed at Issei. "You insulted and challenged the Saiyan. Only getting hit was lucky. Especially a soft love tap like that." Ajuka spoke. He said the final words in a way as to belittle Riser's strength and show the gravity of trying to engage Issei in hand-to-hand combat. "I demand recompense. I demand Rias marry me immediately," Riser stated arrogantly. "The treaty makes her mine by right. She is my property and I am done waiting to collect." His words angered Rias' peerage even more so. Akeno scowled at the filthy man while Issei stepped forward toward Riser, but Graphia raised her hand to lower the hostilities. It seems we are at an impasse, but I believe I have a solution to solve this issue. Her voice was controlled despite her dislike for how Riser spoke to Rias and her friends. Everyone listened as the Queen of Hell spoke. 2 weeks from today, both of your peerages will compete in an official rating game. The peerage of Riser Phoenix against the peerage of Rias Gremory. If Riser wins, then Rias shall marry him on the day afterwards. If Rias wins, then Riser shall have no claim to her and she will be free to pursue whoever she chooses, any she chooses. Whilst House Phoenix will still be bound by its treaty. Graphia stated her suggestion simply, but with the final words her eyes rested solely on Rias. Rias understood the implications of her words and nodded. Both noble devils, Rias and Riser, agreed to the terms. The arrogant devil turned to his subordinates. Ubaluna, Schwalen, we are leaving. This mortal realm is disgusting and filled with freaks. He spoke quickly with his final words directed to Issei, who smirked back to him in reply. The two nodded and moved to their master. The symbol of the Phoenix family shone momentarily and the three vanished. Rias sat onto the couch in an emotionally drained state. She knew Riser would pursue her, but for a date to be set on her fate was quite unnerving. Graphia addressed them all with a soft, compassionate tone. It seems you will all be busy preparing over the next fortnight. Train well and I hope for your success. The Gremory symbol appeared beneath her in a juka before she turned back and addressed the group one last time before leaving. Oh, and your gravity chamber is finished and ready for use. She left as a wide grin and excited expression broke across the face of Issei.